Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's District Administration Web Seminar, which is entitled Accelerate Learning Outcomes with the Science of Reading, which is brought to you by the generous support of our sponsor here today, Square Panda. Now, before we get started, I'd just like to share just a few housekeeping items with you. If at any time you need any technical support today, please use the chat panel, which you can find is on the right side of your screen. Then you just have to select on my name, which is Stephen Blackburn, and then type your message, and I'll get back to you as quickly as I can. If you currently don't have computer speakers, or I know some of our listeners like to listen privately, I'm going to be submitting a phone number and access code in the chat that you'll be able to dial into here, so look out for that. We will also be welcoming any questions you have here today during the webinar with a Q&A session that will be taking place at the very end of the presentation. You can submit any question that you have by using, it's called the Q&A panel, which is at the bottom right side of your screen, and then send your questions to all panelists. If you don't see the chat or the Q&A panels at the moment, look again, it's on the bottom right side of your screen, and then click on the expand triangle, which is located directly in front of the panel name to make sure you have access to it. Also, the last thing I'd like just to point out when we get started is that if you would like to access the web seminar at a later time, you'll be pleased to know that everyone who is registered and of course who is attending here today, you will all receive an email with a link to the slides as well as an archive recording at some point tomorrow. And now it is my pleasure to pass things off to our presenter today, Dr. Vera Blau-McCandless. Hi, Vera. Great to have you with us here today.
Stephen, thank you so much. And welcome, everybody. I'm really excited to be here with all of you today. And I'm going to be talking about the science of reading today, and specifically how some of the insights we've gained from the science of reading across multiple disciplines over the past couple of decades have really might be able to, translate to accelerating learning outcomes in the classroom. So a little bit about me before we really get started here. I'm the Senior Vice President of Education and Research at Square Panda. My background, I'm a trained cognitive neuroscientist. My field of study has been reading development, and specifically looking at brain correlates of reading development and reading challenges, such as in dyslexia. I also have worked as a reading tutor and have taught in Gillingham training, so a little bit of that practical experience in there. So the company Square Panda, you may or may not have heard of us. We are solely focused on the early literacy space. We have educational technology that is multisensory, and we really focus on teaching evidence-based early reading skills to help all the students succeed. So before we dive in, and I'm going to start with a sort of overview of our talk, I wanted to do a quick poll with you. I've been told this is a really nice tool to get to know the audience. And the two questions that sort of I would be interested in knowing about from you is, A, how familiar are you with the science principles of science of reading already? And then the second one that I'm curious about is there any initiatives in your district currently that have helped align your early reading instruction with the science of reading? And I will give that a little bit of time and see how you respond. Okay, wow, this was fast. Thank you so much. So it looks like a lot of you are either very familiar, somewhat familiar with the science of reading principles, and there is sort of a lot of you seem to have something either in the planning stages, and some initiatives seem to even already be in place. But it looks like about 23% here have not decided yet on a specific initiative. So I'm actually really glad to hear that. It looks like we have a good mix, and hopefully what I'm about to present to you is going to help you in no matter which stage you are in. So okay, great. So let's get started. So just a quick overview of today's talk. I'm going to briefly look at, what have we done in the past, right? So there's a long-standing tradition, obviously, here in the United States for us to teach reading. How have we done that? And specifically around early reading, what have some of these main movements been, and where are we currently with that? And then I want to focus in on the science of reading, what that is, and why I think it's really important in the current context of our education, and how we connect basically the basic sciences and applied sciences to education in the classroom. I'm gonna, in the context of that, speak a little bit more about the cognitive neuroscience piece as well. So the brain correlates of reading and what we've learned about how reading develops in the brain. And then hopefully, we'll end with some guidelines for teaching that hopefully you all find useful as well. Okay, just to start out with a very, very brief and high-level history of reading instruction. A lot of you are probably familiar with some of what I'm going to say here, but essentially the reading instruction in the United States over the past 120 years or so has really been this continuously swinging pendulum. And depending on how you define various aspects of these movements, there have really been sort of two mainstream methods of instruction. The idea that we can teach sort of from the top down using whole word or whole language methods, and that, a lot of the systematicity of sort of the correspondence between print and language is going to be discovered along the way, often referred to as the whole word or whole language movement. And on the other hand, a more code-based focus on systematic phonics, and sort of a doubling down on more of a bottom-up teaching approach, right? Really first in the early years, figuring out the correspondence between letters and sounds, and then from there, making your way into really being exposed to more text and such. And I think recently, we've been trying to find sort of what the ideal mix of those elements is. But what we do know, with all of that going on, that we are here in the year 2022, we had a lot of challenges over the past 2 or 3 years, and that unfortunately a lot of our kids have suffered from that, especially those that are already weak, have declined even more in a lot of their early basic reading skills. The PALS of the University of Virginia, PALS assessment report, has recently pointed out that we might be at a 20-year low right now for our early reading skills. And it's really not that surprising given what we had to do, and especially all of you have mastered over the past couple of years with hybrid instruction and a lot of staffing changes, et cetera, et cetera. And so the question really is, well, what can we do? What can we do to help? Is there another way? Are there other ideas and instructional methods that maybe can help us really get everybody back on track, and especially those kids who already struggle, that need to close the biggest gap in reading achievement? And so is there any component that we're missing when we look at the history and we look at these different movements and ideas that have been around for a long time? And I would say this is really where the science of reading enters the picture. And this is for several reasons. There have been, over the past couple of decades, quite a bit of movement in how different disciplines of research and study, not only education, but disciplines such as the cognitive sciences, psychology, disciplines such as the brain sciences or cognitive neuroscience, disciplines such as linguistics, computational sciences. All of these different disciplines over the past sort of 50 years or so have really started to focus in on this one question, which is, how do children learn to read? And the main disciplines here, they're really sort of bringing this information together for the first time. And the main discipline or major disciplines that I want to mention here are really these four. That's not an exclusive list. There's definitely more. But with education really being, the key field, right, that helps us understand and practice how reading instruction is accomplished, how it should be taught, and when certain skills should be introduced. And I think in the field of education, there's also been quite a shift, and at least in my view, in the late 90s, where for the first time we now, have started to look at all of the evidence out there of how reading instruction works, how it is taught, and what might be the most effective way of doing so. And this was, as you know, in 1997, Congress, issued a study with, where NICHD was, hired 14 experts to really look into, can we figure out with everything we know so far, what is the most effective way to teach reading? And this culminated in the National Reading Panel report of 2000 with almost 500 pages, and after about 3 years of work reviewing 340 studies in the realm of education research. And it really has, kind of started a movement for everybody to look into, well, what evidence do we really have, and can we follow this evidence even further? But the important thing here is that it's not just the area or the field of education study anymore that is contributing. There's other fields that have also, over the past decades, made great strides in really trying to figure out from different perspectives how reading development is actually happening, and how potentially, kids who struggle, how we may be able to help them as a result. And one of those disciplines is psychology or cognitive sciences, if we want to make it a little more broad. And this is really the discipline where we study, how do people think and learn, all those cognitive processes. One example would be our understanding has expanded on how memory works, for example. And one thing that we have learned coming from this field is that interleave practice, for example, on certain skills that you're learning is better than block practice, right? That is just a very, very concrete example. But it also concerns itself with questions around attention, how perception works, cognitive processes around problem solving, and how we can really best describe them. And for the realm of reading, it has come up with some really important and key models or frameworks for understanding how reading development works, including the simple view of reading that I will talk about a little bit more later. Now, the third piece in this new bigger puzzle that we're putting together around how kids learn to read is coming from the cognitive neurosciences, which is the study of brain function and structure related to how kids learn to read, and specifically what happens as a transition between being a pre-reader to being fluent reader, right? In those first couple of years of reading development, with so much of the brain, both function and structure actually changes. And again, this is something that I'll give you some examples and show you some more information on that later on. And then the last discipline I want to mention here, although I'm not going to spend time on this much, and this is the field of linguistics, which again, a field that studies language structure, multiple levels of complexity, such as phonetics, phonology, morphology, and so forth. Another really important field. And there's, again, some that I'm leaving out, such as the computational sciences, etc. But I think what's important here is that for the first time, really in our history of, learning about how reading develops, and we are able to look at that and bring different disciplines together and insights from different disciplines together to really help us better understand the process of reading and turn that around, a better understanding of that process, then potentially turning that into being even more effective in the way we teach reading in the classroom, right? The way, the information, the access that we give to information to our teachers, how we support students who struggle, and so forth. So this more richer and holistic picture is actually something that I feel like is really, really key to what this field that we sort of now call the science of reading. And I'm pretty excited that we're moving in that direction. So what is the science of reading then, right? I'm still a little bit underdefined, and so let's really look at that. So it's really this comprehensive body of research that encompasses so many years and decades by now of scientific knowledge. And I think we are at a place now in history we can start bringing that together. Previously, we often sort of, it was more compartmentalized, right? We might pay attention to findings from one area, but not the other. Or there might be a very prominent book of philosophy being published, and that is something that then drove a lot of what we did after that. We, right now, at a point where we can, be a lot more evidence-based and research-driven potentially in how we do things. And nevertheless, I have to be very clear that the science of reading is not a program or a method. It is really just this collection of insights. And the question is always, well, great, you got a collection of insights, but what does it mean, right? Like, how can I actually use this in the classroom? And there's obviously different, more and more programs that, align with these findings. But I think it is nevertheless really important for each and every one of us to get a better and better understanding of what are these findings and what do they mean for, how we might want to go about teaching reading, and especially helping those students who really struggle. So the science of reading helps us understand the cognitive processes that are essential for reading proficiency. And it can also help describe the development of reading skills in both typical readers, but also readers who struggle. And one other aspect of the science reading is that it has already helped debunk a couple of methods used very prominently over the years to teach reading, but are not really based on scientific evidence. And I think if we kind of are able to look at all the good things we have, right, and sort of repackage and over time adjust as we learn more about reading and how it develops, we can always adjust and make our reading instruction more and more effective. That's kind of would be the goal of infusing the science of reading into any program. Now, what does this specifically mean when we look at some of these cognitive processes that I described, for example, and what does it specifically mean when we talk about for example, how reading works in the brain? What are some of these findings that I have, that I'm talking about? And so this next part of the talk, I want to just go a little bit more into that. And what you see here is a reference to an article published in Atlantic in 2016 by another influential researcher. His name is Mark Seidenberg, and he's the author of Language at the Speed of Sight. And where he kind of questions, well, we have learned so much about the reading process, why are we not using it? And again, I think this is an exciting time right now because we can bring this information together. And, just seeing so many of you attend this webinar today makes me feel so hopeful that we really, we are really all here to make some change. And it's a great thing. So, let me talk first a little bit about some of the more influential research findings and models that came out of the realm of psychology or cognitive sciences over the past decades. And probably one of the most important ones to mention here is this framework for how we learn how to read called the simple view of reading. And I'm showing it here as it's originally is a model from the 1980s, developed by Go and Tumner. Where it essentially just states that reading comprehension or fluent reading is ultimately a product of proficiency in word recognition combined with proficiency in language comprehension. And this model has then been further developed into this slightly more nuanced model called the reading rope, and this is some research based on research by Hollis Scarborough. But what you can see and why it is important is that we now have this model basically, and it's been validated many, many times, states that this idea that ultimately if we want to produce a skilled reader, right, which means we want a reader to fluently execute the coordination of word recognition and text comprehension. That's sort of our definition of skilled reading. What we need is many, many skills, right, that go into that. And these skills can be kind of grouped into two big buckets of mastery. One is the mastery of word recognition. We need to be able, every student needs to not only be accurate, but also automatically recognize a lot of the words, especially those that are occurring with high frequency in text. In order to build word recognition, in turn, there's multiple sub-skills or skills that go into that. And one of them is obviously our understanding of the systematic correspondence between letters and sounds, both applied to decoding and spelling, but also our phonological awareness of the individual letter sounds in a word or in language. And this is something that is a little bit counterintuitive But if you think about it, there's really no need for us as human beings to develop any awareness of individual sounds or even slightly larger units, anything below the word level, unless our goal is to now derive meaning from text. And because if I'm communicating with you just orally using the language domain, there's really no need for me to break a word down any further, right? If I'm saying the word cat, I'm conveying the meaning, that's my goal. I don't need to break down the word into cat. Doesn't make any sense, right? The only reason I need to do that is because I want to make connections between letters and sounds that then help me identify what is the printed word about, and then helps me identify or access the meaning of the word, just like I would access the meaning of the word by hearing it, right? The other piece that goes into the word recognition is, of course, learning our sight words. Sight word recognition, I'm sure, that's something we spend a lot of time on for good reasons as well. And so these different strands have to be developed, and over time they get woven into a thicker, more stable strand of skilled word recognition. And they come together sooner or later with our language comprehension abilities. That's the other part that we really need to develop. We can take our time a little bit more with that because without the word recognition piece, initially that's our strongest predictor for comprehension. But soon after, the language comprehension piece, and specifically background knowledge about the world, vocabulary knowledge, knowledge about language structure in English, are all going to become very relevant to help us understand what we read in connected text, right? And so this skill also, various sub-skills have to be woven together over time. And this is what, educators and you and your teachers do on an everyday basis, right? Is develop this rope, making it stronger, making both ropes stronger and stronger, and then bringing it together over the course of literacy development to really then end up with a strong reader, hopefully by 3rd or 4th grade. And at that point, we want kids to really start focusing on what they're reading, right? We want them to learn from text instead of still, struggling with the mechanics of decoding. So with this model in mind, I mentioned already the word recognition part is what's most critical in the early years. And I know a lot of educators, that's where you spend a lot of your time. So why is it so important? We all know, of course, that in an alphabetic language system or a writing system such as English, there is a systematic correspondence between orthography and phonology. And essentially, we need to teach that correspondence because it's it's a system that allows us to essentially then decode any unknown word. Now, word recognition kind of happens in 3 different stages. At least that's one of the models proposed by Samuels. And initially, as we all know, for a lot of kids, either in pre-kindergarten or kindergarten, they may come with very little or no knowledge of letters or letter sound correspondences. And so their word recognition abilities at that point they're non-accurate, right? There's just, they don't know how to do it. So we need to teach these basic skills, including the print concepts and phonological phonemic awareness and letter sound correspondences. And now once we have a little bit of that knowledge, their word recognition abilities start to become a bit more accurate, right? So maybe, the word cat is now being decoded, but it's still decoded very slowly. And often we see the finger, in assistance, and we kind of have to make this translation between the sound and the letter and then kind of bring it back together, right, in our mind before we can access the meaning of the word. And in this stage, word recognition is accurate, but it's still not automatic. And then in the 3rd stage, this is the stage that is really, really important and that we need to pay a lot of attention to, is where word recognition becomes accurate and automatic. And so now, instead of, going cat, now all of a sudden you hear, students saying, oh, cat, right? It's quick, right? You can access it easily. That's the stage where automaticity happens. And it's so important to get automaticity in word recognition, especially for our most frequent words, because it frees up your cognitive resources for other tasks. Ultimately, the goal of reading is for us to comprehend, to learn from text, to be fluent readers, right? We cannot do that if we keep paying too much attention to the mechanics of decoding. So we want to kind of get past that stage. And that is usually what happens in the first couple of years of reading instruction. And, you know, in this graph that I put together here to picture this, the analogy I'm using is kind of like learning to ride a bike. Or maybe you could even say it's, you know, like learning to drive a car in the beginning. There's so many things you got to do at the same time, right? So a lot of your cognitive resources go towards the mechanics. How do I keep my balance? How do I pedal? How do I, you know, things like that, right? But at some point, these sort of lower level tasks become more and more overlearned, as we call it. And from a cognitive science perspective, they become overlearned. And typically this overlearning goes along with sort of a shift of where the processing or how processing happens in the brain. There's a bit more involvement of what we call lower level structures and a lot less uptaking of resources, let's say, that are usually reserved for when you initially learn a new task, right? Attentional resources and such. And those resources are now up, you know, free to do more important things, right? In this case, these resources are now freed up to really be used for comprehending, making inferences about text, predictions, etc. So now it's really about the meaning, and it's less about the code base and the mechanics. So in order to, because word recognition is so important and it's really such a hallmark of being a fluent reader, I thought we could do this little quick experiments with everyone. And those of you who've heard me speak before, this is one of my favorite things to do with an audience. But since, you know, we have a lot of fluent and very experienced readers here on our webinar, what I would love for you to do is just experience that automaticity yourself. And here's a little task that tricks you into doing that, essentially. It's called a strip task. And so what you see here is a row of words, right? And they're printed in different colors. What I would like you to do is just name the color of the word. You can go left to right, top to bottom, and do that as quickly and as accurately as you can. However, do not, and capital N-O-T, do not read the word, okay? So only name the color of the word. And you can kind of see probably where I'm going with this already, but I'll give you about 20 seconds or so to just try it for yourself. Okay, well, how did that go? So if you're anything like me, you probably, you know, were able to do this task, but as you were trying to do it really quickly, you either got slowed down in certain places, or you even, you know, hopefully, if my experiment worked, made a couple of mistakes as you're trying to do this really quickly. And you can see immediately and probably figure out what the reason for this is that, of course, the color that the word is printed in is in direct conflict with, you know, the meaning of the, you know, the meaning of the word, right? So the word blue is printed in green, so there's a direct interference here going on, and that is something what trips you up. But the reason is why it trips you up is even though I'm telling you not to read the word, you are still automatically reading it, right? And that is the point. That is sort of the idea here, is that we want our kids to be at some point at the same level that you are at currently with your word recognition, where you can't even if I tell you not to do it, it's so automated, it's so overlearned that your brain is just gonna do it anyhow, right? It's really hard to suppress that automatic word recognition, and it's a great thing, right? This is something we ideally want to see in everybody who's becoming a fluent reader, is this ability to, you know, this interference effect, right? Okay, so with that being said, and you know, having paid so much attention to why word recognition is important and that we need the skill to be accurate but also automatic, let's talk a little bit more on how, you know, this development happens in the brain and what some of the hallmarks are about how our brains learn to read. On this slide, this is from a book published in 2009. It's a nice book by a French researcher, reading researcher, very famous one, Stanislas Dehaene, who published Reading in the Brain. And he has sort of come up with this overview, a model vision of the cortical networks that are involved in reading. And what you can see immediately when you look at this is the left part of the brain, which is a little bit more in language processing, that there's a whole range of areas, right? And this is pretty one of the biggest findings from research over the past decades, is that there's not one area in the brain that is responsible for executing a skill this complex, but it's really a complex network that, of activations across different parts of the brain that have to work together, like different instruments playing together in a symphony. And if that sort of that concert, everybody playing at the same rate and everybody sort of doing their thing, it works really, really well. However, if there's anything that is sort of out of tune, if you will, or certain parts or skills that are not parts of the network that are not properly activated, then that can lead to struggles in learning how to read. And so there's multiple networks here, but one of the main sort of areas that need to get connected as we learn how to read are really the areas for processing language and the areas for processing print. This is one of the big takeaways, I think, from a few decades of research. And we can dive down even more into that and specifically look at, well, how does this look now for me actually decoding a word, for example? This is a very, very high level view of sort of how words might initially be processed, or how we learn how to read in the initial stages. And it's based on what we call the dual root model of word recognition. And so the idea is that there's essentially two pathways in the brain that help us go from being slow decoders to being really fast and automatic at our word recognition, just like you are. The first one we call the dorsal stream, and it's the stream that sort of originates in the back of our brains, where the visual cortex, occipital lobe, is located. And this is where we initially basically decode or encode the letters that we see, right, in a word, and we represent them in our visual cortex. We increasingly abstractly represent them, and they're then sort of that letter that we visually represent then has to get connected to an auditory or oral language representation, which is sort of when we really focus in on early letter sound and phonics instruction, right? And so as I go through and I read the word k, at, right, I'm making that connection with each of these letters, translating into a language representation of that letter. And then once I have that cat, I go cat. And so blending it together, right? And forming that language representation of the whole word, which then helps me access the meaning of the word, which is, why? Because I already know what the word means, right? If you told me that word, if you just used my oral capacity and you say, oh, do you know what the word cat means? As these, assuming I'm an English speaker. So of course, you know what the word cat means even before you enter school. So it's kind of a bridge to help us initially, put sort of connect print to meaning. And it's called the indirect access to meaning through phonology, through language. And at this point, it's still very slow. It's very difficult, right? It's those word attack strategies that we're teaching at that point. Now, when we start doing this more and more, we start practicing, keep seeing the word cat over and over again, what happens now is that we actually end up diverging from using this indirect route, and we now can shift over to using a much more direct pathway to accessing meaning from print. And this pathway is called the ventral stream, and it's something that it still originates from where we initially process, sort of the visual cortex, where we initially process our written information. But it now it kind of bypasses that slow route, and it's kind of immediately accesses the meaning from print. And at this point, decoding is becoming fast and it's effortless. And this is the stage that, you sort of just experience, right? It's the stage where word recognition becomes really, really automatic. So from how the brain learns to read sort of perspective, it's really the shift from the slow, effortful decoding and involvement of the dorsal route in the brain to shifting to a direct access through that ventral stream. So we can quickly build sight word vocabulary, which then helps us become much more proficient at reading. Now, I do want to spend a minute on this area in the ventral visual stream that is really critical for us to make that shift. It's called the visual word from area, and it's a functional area that develops in response to learning to read. So in other words, this area is an area that activates in response to seeing words as opposed to other types of objects. So for example, a table, a chair, a face, and such a place. And what's really interesting about this functional area is that it essentially doesn't exist, it doesn't activate in kids who have not yet started to learn how to read. So in other words, there is parts of our brain that essentially become active and get trained to do a certain functional task in response to learning how to read. And this happens over the first one or 2 years of reading instruction in particular. And I think this is still very fascinating because this is enormous neuroplasticity. As we teach children how to read, we're just reorganizing such a big part of their brain. We're forming these new networks for just to allow us to master this really complex skill, right? And yet we sometimes pay very little attention of how we can actually support our students in that. And so so that's one of the big findings, I think, again, from the cognitive neurosciences, is really this insight of how this area develops over time. And then thinking about, well, what happens in students, for example, with dyslexia, or students who struggle for other reasons with learning how to read. How can we support them? How can we support that their development of these functional areas and the specialization that is necessary to then make reading really easy? It's also really interesting that we can actually look at the development of these areas over time, and we can even do so in a single child, as Stan DeHane's wife, Ghislaine DeHane Lamberts, has done in 2007. And so what she has done is essentially taken pictures, imaging of a child's brain in response to seeing, words and other types of stimuli, and then looked at, if you contrast those different stimuli, how can we see how does the brain respond? Does it respond more to words yet, as opposed to other types of inputs? And what we see at the end of preschool, and this is in France, there's not really any difference yet, right? The brain sort of treats words very similar to other types of objects. But when they enter after the first, inside the second year of instruction, so after the first year, we kind of starting to see a lot of activity happening all over the brain here. And one of these areas of activity is that visual word from area that is now starting to pop up. And it's becoming active and becoming and processing exactly that information in a very specialized and focused way. And then by the end of the second year, or in this case, third year of instruction, we still see this area being very effective. It's becoming even more focal. A lot of the other areas here in the frontal lobe, parietal areas, are actually sort of taming their activity down. And this has been interpreted as being a sign of this automatized reading, right? So in other words, you don't need so much cognitive effort, attentional resources, and other resources to help you do the same task. It's becoming easier, and therefore, that's at least one interpretation of this data. Therefore, you have actually, again, less involvement of a broad range of brain areas, but it's becoming more and more focal again. So that would be sort of the stage where I'm taking my training wheels off, and I'm now just easily riding along on my bicycle. All right, so hopefully there were some interesting ideas in here for you. The next part of my talk, I want to sort of take everything we talked about so far and just think about, okay, well, if we've learned various things from various disciplines, and that's kind of a unique thing, right? Right now, first time maybe in history where we're bringing all of this information together. But in the end, we still, we have to be in the classroom every day, and we're teaching. And so what are the implications for the classroom and how can this information actually be translated. And I think this is where we really need this deep collaboration between all of the different areas of science and evidence-based methodologies and our educators, who really are the ones making all of this happen. And so when I think about how, should this change the way we teach, I would say yes, it should. But again, it is all driven by the field of education, right? And it's driven by what works in the classroom as much as it is by any of those insights, right? So it's really bringing that knowledge together and making it work for our students, so that ultimately we have sort of the best possible outcomes for them. But at the very high level, I think that the takeaway for me from all of the research over the past couple of decades really has been that if we want to help, or our goal is to help drive those functional changes that I just talked about, the specialization of certain brain areas for certain information, the connection of areas of written with spoken language, that reading rope, right, weaving all of those skills together in the best possible and most efficient way over time. And to do that, we need a focus on the correspondence between letters and sounds and phonics early on. That is definitely a very essential part of it. It is not everything, but is a very essential key element early on. It also needs to happen across multiple levels. So letters and sounds at the lowest level of the hierarchy, right? But then that mapping and the correspondence between how we represent things in the language domain and the language part of the brain, and also sort of the part of the brain that codes for visual information, kind of has to happen across multiple levels of the hierarchy. So letters and sounds, syllables, words, etc., right? So the mapping keeps happening, but the content becomes more and more complex. We also, I think, one thing that really has become very clear is the importance of understanding language structure for learning to read, even at the very early stages. And this is going back to that idea that if I don't have an understanding of an individual sound in a word and how sounds are kind of segmented, or how words are segmented into sounds, it's going to be a lot more difficult for me to start making the connection with the smallest units of print, right? Our letters. And this difficulty is gonna be like a domino effect. So it is also, because of that, it's so important. And I think I know a lot of you are already aware of that and doing much of it, to include a really good phonological awareness program, really breaking things down all the way to the phonemic level, and helping kids really get a good understanding of that, which is especially something that, of course, is harder for our kids that are second language learners that might need additional help with this. And then once we reach sort of the word level of decoding, and we are kind of becoming more proficient at that, again, the automaticity piece is really key. So training to accuracy, but also training to automaticity, so that, words can be recognized quickly. And a lot of this has just simply is repetition, it's exposure, but also sort of modeling can help quite a bit with that. And I just wanted to interject like this really, really quickly, a research study published in 2018, because I think it's just so beautiful to see. We always talk about, well, what's the connection between all these research findings and and the classroom, and how do we make that connection? And I think this is a really cool example of a direct, how this correction happens really directly. So this is a study where Jason Yeatman, who was at the University of Washington and is, I think, now at Stanford, has enrolled kids in an 8-week intensive program. And these were kids who were struggling readers of the Lindemood Bell program, Seeing Stars program. And so again, they were dyslexic students, but they were also control students. And then they started scanning their brains over the course of these 8 weeks. And what they found is that with this really intensive 8-week program, they did not only see functional changes, but they actually saw the structure of the brain changing, and those sort of intensive connections between different parts of the brain, that especially connecting, again, the language with the print realm. There's some of that brain structure and the white matter tracts connecting them, like big highways in the brain, were actually starting to thicken. They were starting to get more robust as a result, as a direct result of this training. And so, with that in mind, I think when we think about what our educators, what you guys do on an everyday basis, it's really, changing brains, right? It's being a brain engineer, and helping our kids get to this amazing place, where they now have a completely new mental ability, which is quite fascinating. Now, given that we talked quite a bit about phonics already, and I do want to say that phonics is really, really important, and that's something that's already been identified with the National Reading Panel report, and it's now validated in a lot of different ways. But phonics is one component, it's one tool, it's not enough, right? The end goal here is always comprehension, and we need to ultimately tackle all 5 components of literacy. But it is important to remember that sequencing can really matter. And when kids struggle, so there's sort of this inverted idea of inverted pyramid, right? Where some skills are definitely really, really key early on. And if you have weaknesses in this, lower level of the pyramid, it's really hard to build sort of this big, heavy umbrella, or a third or second story of comprehension, vocabulary, and fluency on top of a weak foundation, essentially. So what this means for struggling students is that asking ourselves, why are they not achieving this level of proficiency yet? And making sure that we have supports, literacy coaches, and just knowledge in the hands of our teachers as well, who often have not been trained in a lot of this, or a lot of principles around the science of reading, so that we can make the most informed choices of what these students really need on a day-to-day basis. And so what prerequisite skills are they lacking is a really good question to ask if a student is struggling and starting to get very systematic about identifying what those prerequisite skills are. And then sometimes that means taking a step back instead of taking a step forward. So going back to how this could, any of this can actually translate to the classroom. Again, the science of reading is not a program. It's not necessarily a specific method. It is something that should kind of influence the general thinking about, how we might want to approach early literacy learning. And then also it should really help empower our teachers to know what to do when students struggle. And, with a lot of, with classrooms where we have 25 or more students, this differentiation is really hard to do sometimes. So we need tools, right? We need supports to be able to do that as well. But let's look at some of the general guidelines. So guideline 1, definitely provide phonological awareness instruction, ideally with the goal to have every student segment 2 to 3 phonemes in a word. And this should be something that could be achieved like, right around the time that we start to focus more and more on the word level decoding. I think that it's still beneficial, according to the NLP report, to include letters in while we, work on phonemic awareness. But it's also very important to make sure we have enough of that pure oral language, phonological awareness training, all the way up to being able to segment sounds into words into individual sounds. The second guideline, making sure we do provide early and systematic phonics instruction with sufficient intensity. And the question is always like, what's sufficient, right? Again, very much on the student and their proficiency and where they're struggling. But Timothy Shannon, for example, from the University of Chicago, suggests an average of at least 30 minutes a day. And a lot of times that's at minimum 25% of more of a reading block time, which is not nothing. And for a lot of the struggling students, that would, of course, be significantly more. So then the question is, how do we get that intensity of instructions? How do we expand into that, maybe with pull out, push in, or other types of ways of doing that? Guideline 3, provide plenty of opportunities to apply letter sound knowledge and the phonological awareness skills to decoding and spelling. And there's multiple ways of doing that. Again, here I'm just giving an example of our product where we have decodable readers that are both in print and digital format, where kids could learn how to blend letters together into words. And they can also, they're highly sequenced and kind of building as all controlled texts do, only on features and words that kids already know, and yet introducing kind of new words and new sight words and new phonics patterns with each new set. 4, we need to provide explicit and sequenced spelling and word building practice. That's another one that is really key. Research has shown that spending a lot of time on, for example, these word letter games can be really, really beneficial, and that's also something that we do with our product. Last, or not almost last, second to last, I think, make sure we integrate our 5 essential components of reading. We already talked about the pyramid, so just making sure that your curriculum really kind of spends sufficient time on the relevant components at the right time in instructional sequence. And then also what we can do, especially for those students who struggle, is providing them with other learning supports or enhancements as needed. And I think a lot of literacy coaches are doing this in a variety of ways already. But one such idea, for example, is use of manipulative letters, things that you can touch. You integrate the visual, the auditory, and the tactile piece to come to an even more explicit understanding of how letters correspond with sounds and building that strong connection. Now, on a cautionary note, there's many popular reading programs today that are not entirely backed by the science of reading, or some even in conflict with some of the basic principles. And I just wanted to point out some of those principles to watch out for, right? So first of all, obviously, we make sure that everything we're using is evidence-based, and there's now some great tools and things that can help you look that up, including the What Works Clearinghouse by the Department of Education. But also make sure that, to eliminate sort of these teaching methods that are not aligned necessarily. So, for example, guessing strategies around, for word decoding based on cues. That's something that has not been supported in any of those, areas of research that I just described. Or too much focus on silent reading time too early on relative to guided and other explicit work. Lack of an explicit spelling curriculum, for example, it would be another one, or a lack of sufficient systematic and explicit phonics instruction. Of course, that's one of the key elements early on as well. So I want to end, and I know we are almost at time, but this really big question is where are you going with this? I know that there were about 30-something% of you who responded that they were already in the process of implementing or had implemented some programs that are aligned with the science of reading, and we would be really interested kind of to have more discussions about that and know what those are. But generally, whatever we can do to help, whatever I can do to help, we would be more than happy to do so. I think, again, I feel like this is a really interesting point in time where everybody has to come together, and we just need to bring all of these fantastic insights together to really just focus on our students. So where to focus in general, there's a great book by Lisa Motes called The Teaching Reading is Rocket Science. Came out in 2020. And sort of the top 4 elements of change that she points out is really, making sure that all teachers have access to, training in, understanding the basic reading psychology and cognitive science around reading development, understanding language structures for word recognition and language comprehension. So this is going back to the simple view of reading and how these skills have to be woven together. Making sure we apply all best practices in all components of reading instruction, and then using really reliable and efficient assessments to kind of turn that around and making sure we can meet all students where they need to be met. And I want to leave you with this sort of very last slide here on a note on a success story, which is, many of you have seen and heard probably. And Mississippi has been really making great strides on helping their student population become better and better at reading. And they once were really kind of at the bottom of the list for having meeting benchmarks. And now between 2015 and 2019, 65% of kindergartners have met the end of year target in 2019, and that was up from 50% since 2015, and similar with the third grade reading assessments, which is an absolutely stunning rate of growth. And I think what it tells us is that basically nothing is impossible, right? Even if there's You are in a district right now. There's a lot of students struggling, and I know it can be very, very difficult and hard, especially with the pandemic and all of those changes and constant adaptations you need to make. But nevertheless, I think there is really a lot of hope for us if we are open, if we pull in all the information, we're bringing all these disciplines together, that we can, all make these kind of gains. And it's interesting to kind of analyze further what has happened in Mississippi, but I won't, do that right now given the time. I just want to leave you with this positive note. I think anything is possible, and we are really, really excited to potentially collaborate with you, or even if you just want to reach out to me, ask further questions, and I hope this was a really successful and informative session for you. So I want to thank you for your attention for now. There's a little QR code here that helps you access if you want to learn more about Square Panda. We have a white paper as well you can download, and of course you can check us out more online. Thank you so much, and I know that I think we have a few minutes for potential question or two.
Yes, definitely. Well, thank you, Vera, for your time with us today. Now we do have about 4 minutes or so for a Q&A, which is completely fine. Even if we don't get to your question here today, please submit it into the Q&A panel, and we'll get back to you after the webinar at some point privately to answer your questions. So I see that there's some questions coming in. Oh, actually, someone just asked a question about where they can find the white paper.
So it is possible to download it from our website. And I don't know if others on this call have other ideas, but that's definitely one place to get it. Oh, I think Brandy is just putting it in the chat here for you.
Perfect. Let's see, another question. So for districts that are wanting to get started with this, where's the best place they can start to get this process going?
Yeah, I think it would be, and we can put more information also in the chat. It would be, reaching out to you could reach out directly to our sales team at sales@SquarePanda. You can also start with our website, and there's direct ways to engage with different people in the company, so you can get a quote and get more information.
Perfect. And I just went back to the slide with the QR code, so just in case.
Yeah, with that's an easy way to do it too. Thank you, Stephen.
Awesome. And I would just like to say, this isn't necessarily a question, but getting a lot of messages and, thanking us for the presentation, saying that they're delighted to know that this is still a relevant topic. So they really appreciate you speaking on this, and we do as well. Perfect. All right. Well, we are at the very top of the hour, which is completely fine. If you have any more questions that you would like our friends over at Square Panda to answer, please feel free to continue inputting them into the chat, and they'll get to them at some point privately after the webinar. And also, when I go through my final slides, continue to put them in the chat. Not a problem. And I'd just like to say to our audience, I'd like to thank you for joining us today as well. For those who enjoy our webinar today, there are many more upcoming web seminars like this one that are provided by us at District Administration, which is the leader in editorial coverage of news, trends, as well as current issues in K through 12. We have a wide range of readers here at DA who subscribe for free, and they stay up to date with us through our print magazine, online, of course, and through our newsletters and web seminars like this one. Also, if you would like to watch this web seminar again, or for those of you who believe that the solutions that Vera provided for us today would be helpful to your colleagues, as I'm sure they will be, you will be pleased to know that our team at DA will be sending you an email later tomorrow with an on-demand recording of this web seminar and a link to the slides. So with that, on behalf of DA, this is Stephen Blackburn. Thanks, everyone. Take care, be well, and stay safe, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you.